just a quiet old man at the U.S. Marines training camp, until a recruit spotted his tattoo and froze. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. As the general's words echoed across the training camp, the silence that followed was heavy, thick with disbelief. Thomas stood frozen, his eyes locked on the elderly man, now revealed as Sergeant Major John Miller. The old janitor he had so carelessly mocked now stood with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned the respect of an entire army, a living legend. The recruits who had been snickering just moments ago now stood motionless, their faces a mixture of awe and embarrassment. The general's sharp gaze scanned the group, and his commanding voice broke the silence. You all will never forget this moment. You just witnessed the power of humility and respect. He turned to Sergeant Major Miller, his voice softer now, but filled with deep reverence. It's an honor, sir. Miller nodded slightly, the faintest of smiles touching his lips, but his eyes remained steady and unshaken. As the general gestured for the recruits to gather around, the atmosphere in the camp had shifted entirely. The cocky, youthful bravado that had once filled the air now hung awkwardly, like a heavy cloud. Thomas felt the weight of his actions crash over him. His heart pounded in his chest, and his throat tightened. The sergeant major wasn't just a war hero. He was a symbol of everything Thomas had yet to understand about true courage and service. With every step that the general took, the respect in the camp grew. The recruits, still processing what had just happened, slowly began to realize the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Miller had never asked for respect. He didn't need to. His very presence commanded it. But the story that would follow would make the recruits understand why. The general turned to the assembled recruits, his voice now filled with authority and emotion. Let me tell you who this man is, the general began. Sergeant Major Miller, this man you've just mocked, was one of the first operators in the Special Forces. He's been on more classified missions than most of you will ever hear about. He's the reason many of you are here today. He saved countless lives on the battlefield, and he did it without ever seeking recognition. As the general spoke, the recruits listened in rapt attention, each word hitting them like a ton of bricks. Thomas stood motionless, his mind racing, trying to reconcile the old man who had been the subject of his mockery with the legendary figure the general was describing. Miller's face remained stoic, but there was a quiet strength in his eyes. The general continued, his voice growing more intense. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, during one of the fiercest firefights of the war, Sergeant Major Miller carried an entire squad of men to safety. Under heavy enemy fire, with nothing but his wits and his bare hands, he led them to a safe extraction point. He didn't stop. He never hesitated. That's the kind of man you're dealing with here. The recruits looked from Miller to the general, still unsure of how to react, but the gravity of the moment settled in. They had just witnessed the unveiling of a hero, a man who had lived through things that could never be fully understood. A man who had given more to his country than any of them could imagine. Thomas's chest tightened as the general spoke of the sacrifice and humility that had shaped Miller's life. You think this is a man you can laugh at? The general asked, his gaze sweeping over the group. Do you think he's just some old guy? This man is the embodiment of everything we stand for. Duty, honor, country. The silence that followed was profound, and for the first time, Thomas felt truly ashamed. He couldn't even look Miller in the eye. He had misjudged this man, completely. The general's voice softened, but there was still a firm resolve in his words. Now, I want you to do something that might be difficult for some of you. I want you to stand up. I want you to salute this man, not because he's an old veteran, but because he has earned the right to be saluted. Thomas hesitated for just a moment before he realized that the other recruits had already begun to rise, their bodies moving automatically, as if guided by something larger than themselves. One by one, they stood tall, and their arms shot to their foreheads in sharp, respectful salutes. The sound of boots hitting the ground in unison echoed across the camp. And when Thomas finally stood, his arm trembling slightly, he saluted the man he had once mocked. He felt a deep, humbling sense of respect flow through him, something he would never forget. The general, his voice calm now, addressed the recruits one last time. This is the kind of man you should strive to be. This is the kind of legacy you should aim for. Not in words, not in titles, but in actions. In the way you carry yourself. In the way you serve. This man, Sergeant Major Miller, has earned everything he has through his deeds, not his words. As the recruits lowered their salutes, the tension that had once filled the air began to dissipate. Miller, still standing there, seemed to absorb the weight of their newfound respect. His role in this moment, his presence, spoke volumes more than any words ever could. Thomas, standing among the recruits, realized that this moment would define his time in the Marines. It wasn't just about the physical training. It was about learning the true meaning of respect, honor, and sacrifice. And for that, he would be forever grateful. As the last of the recruits finished saluting, the camp seemed to settle into a newfound calm. Sergeant Major John Miller stood at the center of the training ground, his figure tall and unyielding. The recruits, once full of youthful arrogance, now stood in quiet awe, their perceptions forever changed. Thomas, who had once dismissed the old man as nothing more than a relic, now stood with his head lowered, lost in thought. The general, who had orchestrated this moment of revelation, looked around at the recruits with a sense of satisfaction. This, he said, his voice still carrying the weight of authority, is what it means to earn respect. Not through titles, not through the number of medals you wear, but through the way you serve and lead. He turned to Sergeant Major Miller, offering a nod of reverence. Thank you, sir. You've done more for this camp today than any drill instructor could ever teach. Miller nodded once, his gaze scanning the recruits. He did not speak often, and when he did, it was always measured. But in that moment, there was a quiet understanding between him and the young Marines. His actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. As the general moved to address the rest of the recruits, Miller quietly stepped aside, watching them with a gaze that saw through their bravado. Thomas, still processing the gravity of the moment, couldn't help but feel a twinge of shame. He had never understood the true meaning of respect, not until now. In the days that followed, the training camp's atmosphere shifted. Recruits began to approach Miller with newfound humility. They started to listen more intently when he offered a word of advice or guidance. No longer was he just the quiet janitor. He was a living history book, a man whose past could never be understood in the classroom or in a manual. Thomas, in particular, found himself drawn to the old man. During breaks, he would sit with him, quietly observing, hoping to learn something he had never been taught. One afternoon, as they sat in the mess hall, Thomas hesitated before speaking. Sergeant Major, I wanted to apologize for what I said before. I had no idea who you were. I thought you were just some old man doing the dirty work. Miller's eyes met his, but he did not immediately respond. There was no anger in his gaze, no harsh words, just the calm wisdom of someone who had seen it all. After a long pause, Miller spoke, his voice low but steady. We all have our roles, son. Some of us clean, some of us lead. But it's not the role that defines you. It's what you do with it. Thomas nodded, taking in the lesson. For the first time, he understood the depth of Miller's words. Respect wasn't something that could be demanded. It had to be earned, day by day, through actions, through the way you treated others, and through the sacrifices you were willing to make. The next morning, during training, the recruits noticed a change in Thomas. He was no longer the cocky young Marine trying to prove himself. He was focused, determined, and humble in his approach. He sought out Miller's guidance, listening closely to the wisdom the old man offered. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. It wasn't just about learning to march or handle weapons. It was about learning what it meant to be a Marine, a person of honor, discipline, and respect. The days passed, and the training camp continued. The recruits faced challenges, both physical and mental, but they now carried with them the lessons that Miller had silently taught them. They learned that true strength didn't come from how loud you could shout or how much you could lift. It came from the quiet resolve to do the right thing, even when no one was watching. On the final day of boot camp, after the last grueling obstacle course and the final inspection, the recruits stood in formation for one last time. The general, now smiling, walked down the line, nodding at each recruit. When he reached Thomas, he paused for a moment, then offered a rare smile. "You've come a long way, son. You've learned more than I ever expected." Sergeant Major Miller would be proud. Thomas's chest swelled with pride, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly seen. As the recruits filed out of the camp, ready to begin their next chapter, Thomas glanced back one last time at the old man standing by the barracks. Miller stood as he always had, quietly watching, his posture straight and proud. He wasn't just a janitor. He was a symbol of everything the Marines stood for: honor, duty, and respect. And Thomas knew that no matter where he went, that lesson would stay with him forever. The days that followed were different for the recruits. The atmosphere at the camp had shifted. What once had been a place filled with youthful arrogance and untested confidence was now a place where every recruit carried with them the weight of understanding that came from a lesson in humility. The story of Sergeant Major John Miller had woven itself into the fabric of their daily lives. The man who had been nothing more than a janitor in their eyes was now someone they all respected deeply. Thomas, in particular, found himself carrying that lesson with him every day. No longer was he the brash, overconfident recruit. Now, he was a Marine who knew that respect had to be earned through actions, not words. As training progressed, the recruits grew stronger, physically and mentally. But even more important than the obstacles they faced on the obstacle course or the endless drills was the quiet way they began to treat each other. No longer did they mock one another or take their comrades for granted. They began to act like a unit, a family. And at the center of it all was Miller, whose quiet presence continued to guide them. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling day of drills, Thomas found himself sitting on the barracks steps, his mind racing. He had been working harder than ever, pushing himself to the limit. But something about the day felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Miller's story, more that he needed to learn. The old man had never spoken much about his past. He was a man of few words, content to let his actions speak for him. But Thomas had a need to understand. He had to know more about the man who had so profoundly impacted his life. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Thomas found himself walking toward the barracks where Miller was often seen cleaning or organizing. The older man was just finishing sweeping the steps when Thomas approached him. "Sergeant Major," he began hesitantly, "I was wondering if you could tell me more about your time in the service. About the things you did, the things that made you who you are." Miller didn't immediately respond. He simply stood there for a moment, the broom still in his hand, his eyes thoughtful. Then, slowly, he turned to face Thomas. "What do you want to know, son?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Thomas sat down on the steps beside him, looking up at the man who had seen more than anyone could ever imagine. I guess I just want to understand what it means to be a Marine, to really live by the values you talk about." Miller let out a small sigh, as if weighing his words carefully. Then he spoke, his voice slow but clear. "Being a Marine isn't about how much you can lift, how fast you can run, or how many medals you can wear. It's about knowing when to stand up and when to sit down. It's about making the right choice, even when it's hard. And it's about having a sense of duty, doing what's right because it's right, not because anyone's watching." Thomas listened intently, every word sinking in. Miller's voice held the kind of weight that only years of experience could provide. The old man wasn't just speaking to him. He was passing down a legacy. "I learned that lesson the hard way," Miller continued, his gaze distant as if lost in the past. "There was a time when I had to make a choice, one that would haunt me for the rest of my life. But I made it because it was the right thing to do, no matter the cost." Thomas, moved by the depth of Miller's words, found himself at a loss for what to say. The humility of the man beside him was more than he could ever have imagined. It was clear that Miller's past was one filled with sacrifice and painful choices, things that no amount of training or drills could prepare him for. "I don't know if I could ever be like you," Thomas admitted quietly. "I don't know if I could make the kinds of choices you've had to make." Miller looked at him, his eyes softer now, but still filled with that quiet strength. "You will, son. You'll face your own trials, your own decisions. And when the time comes, you'll know what to do. You just have to remember that being a Marine isn't about perfection. It's about doing your best and learning from every step you take." The conversation lingered in the air long after Miller had finished speaking. Thomas sat there, taking it all in. He had always admired the idea of what it meant to be a Marine, But now, he understood it on a deeper level. It wasn't about the physical strength or the uniform. It was about the man you were inside, the choices you made, and the way you treated those around you. That evening, as the recruits returned to their barracks, something had changed. They had grown stronger as a unit, not just in body, but in mind and spirit. And as for Thomas, he knew he still had a long way to go, but he was no longer the same young man who had once mocked an old man sweeping the floor. He was a Marine now, one who understood what it meant to earn respect, to lead by example, and to carry the weight of duty with honor. Miller, meanwhile, continued his work in the background, quietly watching over the young Marines. His role had not changed. He was still the janitor, still the humble presence. But to those who had come to know him, he was something far more. He was the embodiment of what it meant to serve with dignity, to fight not for recognition, but for the love of country, and for the brotherhood that came with it. The days that followed were a blur of intense training, but for Thomas, they felt different now. The lessons he had learned from Sergeant Major John Miller were no longer just ideas floating in the back of his mind. They were the foundation of everything he did. Every drill, every obstacle course, every command from his instructors was now filtered through the lens of respect and duty that Miller had taught him. It wasn't just about passing the tests anymore. It was about understanding the deeper meaning behind them. The recruits, too, had shifted. There was no more mocking, no more dismissive comments. They had all seen the same thing that Thomas had. The true nature of a Marine wasn't defined by strength alone, but by integrity, humility, and sacrifice. One morning, during a particularly grueling session of physical training, Sergeant Major Miller appeared at the edge of the field, watching the recruits with quiet attentiveness. He wasn't there to command or to judge. He was just there, observing, as he always had. Thomas, now fully aware of the weight of Miller's presence, found himself pushing harder. His muscles screamed in protest, but the thought of quitting didn't cross his mind. He kept his eyes on the ground, focusing on the rhythm of his breath, the feel of his boots pounding the dirt. Push yourself, but know when to stop, Miller had said once. It's about knowing your limits and pushing past them, but it's also about knowing when to listen to your body. As the session wrapped up, the recruits gathered around, their faces drenched with sweat and determination. Thomas felt a sense of pride in the group that wasn't there before, a unity that had come from shared struggle. As they stood in formation, Miller approached, his steps slow but deliberate. The young Marines stood straighter, subconsciously falling into a more respectful posture. Thomas glanced at Miller, wondering what the old man would say. Miller paused before speaking, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of years of experience. "You've all done well today," he said, his eyes scanning the group. "But remember, strength doesn't come from physical power alone. It comes from the mind. It comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for." Thomas couldn't help but feel that these simple words carried more meaning than any drill instructor's speech. Miller wasn't just speaking to them as soldiers. He was speaking to them as men and women who would one day face choices far more difficult than any obstacle course. It was that moment of clarity that stuck with Thomas long after the training was over. Later that evening, as the camp settled into its usual routine, Thomas found himself walking toward the barracks, his mind swirling with everything he had learned. He couldn't help but think of the stories Miller had shared with him, the quiet moments of reflection where the old man had opened up about his time in the field. It wasn't always about heroics or grand gestures. Sometimes, the hardest battles were the ones fought within. The sun had set, and the camp was bathed in the soft glow of the moon when Thomas saw Miller again, sitting on the steps of the barracks, as he often did. The old man's silhouette was framed against the dim light, the faintest of smiles playing on his lips as he watched the recruits begin to wind down. Thomas walked up to him, his steps measured, unsure of how to continue the conversation they had started. "Sergeant Major," he began, his voice filled with a quiet respect, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about knowing who you are." Miller looked up at him, his eyes sharp but warm. "What are you thinking, son?" he asked, his tone inviting but not demanding. I think I'm starting to understand," Thomas said slowly. "It's not just about the training. It's about the kind of person I want to be, what I want to stand for, not just in the Marines, but in life." Miller nodded, his face unreadable, but in his eyes, Thomas could see something that made him feel understood. Good, Miller said, his voice low. Because that's what it's all about. The Marines will teach you many things. But it's up to you to decide what kind of person you'll be when the uniform comes off. Thomas sat down beside Miller, the two of them sharing a quiet moment under the stars. For the first time, he wasn't just a recruit trying to prove himself. He was a Marine, learning what it meant to live with honor, to carry the weight of responsibility, and to respect not just the title, but the values behind it. The next few weeks passed by in a blur of training, but the changes in Thomas were subtle yet profound. He was no longer the same young man who had mocked an old veteran. He had learned, through actions and words, what it meant to earn respect. It wasn't something you could demand. It was something you had to live every single day. And as the day of their final test approached, Thomas found himself ready, not just to pass, but to honor everything he had learned, everything Miller had taught him. The time for proving himself was over. Now, it was time to become the kind of Marine Miller had always known he could be. The morning of the final test arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. For the recruits, it was the culmination of weeks of hard work, sweat, and sacrifice. For Thomas, it was the moment that would define his journey, not just as a Marine, but as a person. The sun rose slowly over the camp, casting long shadows across the training ground. The sound of boots hitting the gravel echoed in the distance as the recruits gathered in formation. The general walked through the ranks, his eyes scanning the group, taking in each individual with a look that spoke volumes. But today, his attention was not on the physical tests or the drills. Today was about something deeper, something more important. Today was about showing what they had truly learned. Thomas stood tall in his formation, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the last few weeks, the lessons from Sergeant Major Miller, all of it was building inside him. He could feel the eyes of his fellow recruits on him, but he no longer cared about being the fastest, the strongest, or the loudest. What mattered now was the strength inside him, the quiet resolve that had grown from his time under Miller's watch. As the final test began, the recruits were pushed to their limits. The obstacle course was brutal, the heat oppressive, and the challenges relentless. But for Thomas, it felt different now. Every jump, every crawl, every sprint was no longer just a test of his physical limits. It was a test of his character. With each obstacle, he remembered Miller's words, "Strength comes from within, not just from the body." And he remembered that being a Marine wasn't just about how fast you could move, but about how you could keep going when you wanted to stop. The test wasn't just about the drills. It was about how they handled adversity, how they rose to the challenge when everything felt impossible. Thomas moved with purpose, his breath steady, his muscles screaming, but his mind clear. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't just racing through the course anymore. He was proving to himself that he could live up to the values that had been instilled in him. As he neared the final leg of the obstacle course, Thomas felt the familiar weight of his pack on his back. It was heavy, but it wasn't just the pack that weighed him down. It was the realization that everything he had done up until this point had been leading to this moment. It was time to show what he was made of. The final challenge loomed ahead, a wall that seemed impossible to scale. The recruits ahead of him had struggled with it, their faces contorted with frustration as they tried and failed to climb. Thomas approached the wall, his mind calm despite the tension in the air. He had seen others struggle with this exact obstacle, but he wasn't like them anymore. He knew he could do this. He took a deep breath, placed his hands on the wall, and began to climb. His muscles burned, his fingers scraped against the rough surface, but he kept climbing. His focus was sharp, his determination unwavering. As he reached the top of the wall, he felt a rush of accomplishment. He had done it. But the real victory wasn't in making it over the wall. The real victory was in proving to himself that he could keep going, no matter how hard it got. As he dropped down to the other side, he glanced around. His fellow recruits were still struggling with the wall, some of them barely making it. But Thomas knew that, in his own way, he had already won. The test wasn't over yet, but he had already passed the hardest part. The rest of the day was a blur of drills, evaluations, and final inspections. But even as the day drew to a close, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of accomplishment that had settled in his chest. He had faced the challenge head-on, not just with strength, but with the kind of quiet resolve that he had learned from Miller. As the recruits gathered one last time in the barracks, Thomas found himself standing at the back of the group, his mind racing with everything that had happened. He had done it. He had made it through. But more importantly, he had learned what it meant to truly earn the title of Marine. As the general approached, his eyes scanning the group, Thomas felt a deep sense of pride. The general nodded, and without a word, the recruits began to disperse. Thomas stood for a moment longer, letting the weight of everything sink in. It wasn't about the physical tests, or the drills, or even the obstacles. It was about the person he had become. A Marine, yes. But more than that, a man who had learned what it meant to live with honor, humility, and respect. Later that evening, after the camp had quieted down, Thomas found himself back at the barracks, sitting on the steps, his mind still processing the events of the day. He could see Miller in the distance, quietly cleaning up after the day's activities, just as he always did. Thomas walked over to him, his steps purposeful but respectful. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice steady but full of gratitude. "I just wanted to say thank you. For everything." Miller turned to him, his expression unreadable, but his eyes softened. "You did well today," he said quietly. "But remember, this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. The real test comes when you step outside these gates. That's when you'll find out who you really are." Thomas nodded, understanding that this moment, this lesson, would stay with him forever. He had come a long way since the day he first mocked the old man sweeping the barracks. And now, standing before Miller, he knew that he wasn't just a Marine. He was a man who had learned what it truly meant to serve, to respect, and to honor the legacy of those who had come before him. The days after the final test were marked by a sense of quiet reflection. The recruits moved through their daily routines, but there was something different in the air. The usual chatter and light-hearted mockery were gone. In its place was a newfound respect for one another, a sense of shared understanding that had been forged through the crucible of training and the lessons they had learned along the way. Thomas felt it too. The arrogance that had once driven him was replaced by a quiet confidence, one that came not from showing off his strength, but from knowing who he was and what he stood for. The camp felt different, as though the very ground beneath their boots had absorbed the weight of the transformation that had taken place. But even as the recruits grew stronger and more united, there were moments when Thomas couldn't help but reflect on the lessons that had brought him here. There was one lesson that stood out above the rest, one that had stuck with him from the very first day. It was a lesson from Sergeant Major Miller, one that had become more than just words to Thomas. It had become a way of life. "It's not about being the best," Miller had said once. "It's about doing your best, and that's what makes the difference." Those words had echoed in Thomas's mind ever since, especially during moments when things seemed impossible, when doubt crept in and the temptation to quit was strong. But now he understood. It wasn't about the outcome, it was about the journey. One afternoon, as Thomas was walking toward the mess hall, he saw Miller standing near the edge of the camp, looking out over the training grounds. The old man's posture was as straight as ever, his expression unreadable, but there was a quiet strength in the way he stood. Thomas couldn't help but approach. "Sergeant Major," he called, his voice steady but filled with a deep sense of gratitude. Miller turned to him, his eyes sharp but kind. "You've come a long way, Thomas," he said, his voice low. "You've learned what it means to be a Marine, but now you have to learn what it means to lead." Thomas nodded, unsure of how to respond. He had spent so much time focused on proving himself that the idea of leadership had never truly crossed his mind. But now, as Miller's words sank in, he realized that the next step wasn't about continuing to prove himself. It was about helping others, lifting them up the same way that Miller had lifted him. "But I don't know if I'm ready," Thomas admitted, his voice laced with doubt. "I'm still learning, still figuring it out." Miller gave a small smile, the faintest hint of approval in his gaze. "That's what makes you ready," he said. "The fact that you're willing to learn. Leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about knowing how to listen, how to guide others, and how to show them the way even when you're still figuring it out yourself." Thomas absorbed those words, feeling the weight of them. He had never thought of leadership that way before. It wasn't about being perfect or knowing everything. It was about being present, being willing to grow, and being ready to help others do the same. As the days passed, Thomas began to embrace this new responsibility. He started noticing the other recruits, seeing their struggles, their doubts, and their potential. He began offering encouragement where it was needed, helping his fellow Marines through the toughest parts of their training. And slowly, he began to see the transformation in them as well. They began to push themselves harder, to challenge one another in ways they never had before. And in that process, Thomas realized something important. True leadership wasn't about being in charge. It was about building others up, about making the people around you better, stronger, more confident. It was about taking the lessons he had learned from Miller and passing them on. One evening, as the recruits gathered for their final group meeting before they would be sent off for their next assignment, Thomas stood at the front of the room, feeling a sense of pride swell within him. The recruits had come a long way since the first day, and so had he. They had learned the importance of respect, humility, and duty. And now, Thomas felt ready to take on the next challenge, not just as a Marine, but as a leader. As the general entered the room, his eyes scanned the group, taking in the transformation that had taken place. He nodded approvingly and then spoke. "You've all done well," he said, his voice filled with authority and pride. "But remember, this is just the beginning. Being a Marine is about more than just completing the course. It's about continuing to grow, continuing to learn, and continuing to serve with honor." Thomas stood a little taller, the weight of those words sinking in. The general's gaze turned toward him. "Thomas," he said, "you've shown great potential. Keep leading by example, and the path ahead will be a rewarding one." In that moment, Thomas knew that everything he had been through, the tests, the struggles, the lessons, had been leading him to this point. He was no longer just a recruit trying to prove himself. He was a Marine, ready to lead others the way he had been led. As the meeting ended and the recruits filed out of the room, Thomas stood at the door for a moment, watching them. He could see the same determination in their eyes that he had once had. And he knew, without a doubt, that the legacy of Sergeant Major John Miller, the lessons of respect, duty, and leadership, would live on through them. Thomas had become the kind of man Miller had always known he could be. And in doing so, he had earned his place, not just as a Marine, but as a leader, someone who could inspire others to reach their full potential. As the days passed after their final evaluation, the reality of their next step began to set in. The recruits who had entered the camp with uncertain steps now stood tall, ready for whatever came next. For Thomas, it felt like a turning point. He had come so far since the first day, and yet, there was still much more to learn, much more to prove. The lessons from Sergeant Major Miller had shaped him into someone different. He was no longer driven by the same arrogance that had once fueled him. He understood now that being a Marine wasn't about the physical challenges. It was about leadership, integrity, and duty. And the test he faced now wasn't one of strength or speed. It was one of character. That morning, after the final formation, the general gathered the recruits together for one last address. The sun was already rising over the horizon, painting the camp in shades of gold and orange, and there was a stillness in the air that felt like the calm before a storm. As the general's voice rang out, it was clear that today wasn't just another day. It was a day of reckoning, a day where they would all be reminded of the responsibility they were about to bear. "You've completed your training," the general said, his voice steady and firm. "But understand this, training doesn't end here. This is just the beginning. The real test comes when you step out of this camp, when you go out into the world and face challenges that are beyond anything we've prepared you for. It's then that your character will truly be tested." Thomas stood among his fellow recruits, feeling the weight of those words. He had always thought the hardest part was the physical training, the endless drills, the obstacle courses. But now, he understood that the real test lay beyond the walls of the camp. In the real world where the stakes were higher, the consequences more severe. As the general finished his speech and the recruits began to disperse, Thomas found himself walking alone along the perimeter of the camp. His mind raced, thinking about everything he had learned. He had pushed himself to the limits, physically and mentally. But there was something else, something deeper, that he needed to understand. It wasn't just about the Marine Corps values. It was about the personal growth he had undergone, about the man he had become. He thought back to the many lessons Miller had taught him. There was the lesson about humility, about knowing that respect couldn't be demanded, it had to be earned. There was the lesson about leadership, about how it wasn't about being in charge, but about lifting others up and showing them the way. And, of course, there was the lesson about character, about being true to yourself, even when no one was watching. As Thomas walked, his footsteps slow and deliberate, he realized something. Everything he had been taught, everything he had learned, was all leading him to this moment. It was about embracing the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. It wasn't just a symbol of strength. It was a symbol of honor, duty, and sacrifice. And now, it was his turn to carry that legacy forward. That evening, after the camp had quieted down, Thomas found himself standing at the same spot where Miller had once stood, looking out over the training grounds. The camp, which had once felt like a battlefield, now seemed peaceful, almost serene. The lights of the barracks flickered in the distance, and the sound of crickets filled the air. For the first time, Thomas didn't feel the rush of adrenaline that he had come to associate with his training. Instead, he felt a sense of calm. It was the calm that came from knowing who he was, knowing what he stood for, and knowing that he was ready for whatever came next. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to find Miller walking toward him, his figure silhouetted against the fading light of the evening. The old man didn't speak at first. He simply stood beside Thomas, gazing out over the camp. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then, Miller broke the silence. "You've come a long way, Thomas," he said, his voice low and steady. "But remember, the hardest battles are the ones you face after you leave here. The world is full of challenges that will test you in ways you can't even imagine. But if you keep the lessons you've learned close, if you remember who you are, you'll be ready." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of the words. He knew that Miller was right. The real test was ahead of him. It wasn't about the obstacles in front of him. It was about how he responded to them. It was about the choices he made when no one was looking. And with that realization, something inside him clicked. He was ready. "Thank you, Sergeant Major," Thomas said, his voice filled with gratitude. Miller gave him a small nod, his face unreadable as always, but his eyes soft. "You've got what it takes," he said simply. "Just remember, it's not the uniform that makes you a Marine. It's the man inside it." As the two of them stood there, side by side, watching the sun set over the camp, Thomas felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. He wasn't just ready to be a Marine. He was ready to be the kind of man who could live up to the ideals the Marine Corps stood for. And in that moment, he knew he would carry those ideals with him wherever he went, no matter where. The journey took him. Weeks passed, and the recruits were soon facing their next chapter, their first deployment. For Thomas, it was a moment of anticipation mixed with unease. The lessons he had learned in training were now going to be tested in the real world, and the reality of what it meant to be a Marine was beginning to settle in. Sergeant Major Miller's words echoed in his mind. "The hardest battles are the ones you face after you leave here." It wasn't the physical challenges that would define him anymore. It was how he responded to the challenges of the world outside the camp. The deployment was different from anything they had trained for. This was real. This was where lives were on the line. The camp, once a place of endless drills and routine, now felt like a distant memory. The noise of the base was replaced by the hum of military transport, the sound of distant helicopters, and the heavy weight of expectation that hung in the air. The team was readying itself for an assignment in a foreign country, one where the stakes were high and the consequences could be life-changing. Thomas could feel the shift within himself. Gone was the cocky, naive recruit who had first stepped foot on the training grounds. The man standing there now was different. He was calm, focused, ready. But there was still that lingering question. Was he truly ready for what lay ahead? As the team gathered for their briefing, the weight of the situation hit him all at once. They weren't just going through the motions anymore. This wasn't a drill. The general, who had been a figure of authority throughout their training, stood at the front of the room, outlining the mission in precise detail. "We've been called to assist in a volatile region," the general began, his voice steady but laced with a seriousness that sent a chill through the room. "Our mission is critical. Lives are at stake, and every decision you make will have consequences." Thomas listened carefully, absorbing every word. He wasn't thinking about himself anymore. He wasn't thinking about proving anything. He was thinking about the mission, about the people who depended on them, about doing his part to ensure success. The general's voice cut through the tension. "This mission requires teamwork. Each one of you must rely on the person next to you. There is no room for hesitation, no room for mistakes. You are here because we trust you. Do not let us down." As the briefing ended and the team prepared to move out, Thomas felt the weight of the responsibility press on him. This wasn't just about completing the mission. It was about the people they would encounter along the way, the lives they would impact. It was about making the right decisions in the heat of the moment, when things didn't go according to plan. The flight to the deployment zone felt surreal. Thomas sat quietly, looking out of the window as the landscape below changed. He could see the vast desert stretching out beneath them, the rugged terrain that would soon become their new reality. The hum of the aircraft was the only sound, a constant reminder of the journey they were about to take. When they finally arrived, the scene was nothing like the safety of the training camp. The base was small, surrounded by high walls and constant security patrols. The air was thick with tension, the sounds of distant gunfire echoing in the background. The team was immediately briefed on the situation on the ground, a volatile region filled with conflict, where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. Thomas looked around at his team, their faces set with determination. He had trained with these men and women, learned from them, and now they would face the challenges of the real world together. There was no turning back. As they moved out on their first mission, the weight of it all began to sink in. They weren't just playing soldiers anymore. This was real. The terrain was harsh, the heat unbearable, and the constant threat of danger loomed over them at every turn. But as the days passed, Thomas felt a sense of clarity that he hadn't experienced before. Everything he had learned in training, the lessons from Miller, the importance of respect, of integrity, of duty, came rushing back. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. One night, after a particularly grueling day, Thomas found himself alone in the barracks, his mind racing. He couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't fully prepared for what was ahead. But then, he thought about Miller. He thought about the quiet strength the old man had shown, the way he had faced every challenge with a calm resolve. And Thomas realized something. Miller wasn't just teaching him how to be a Marine. He had been teaching him how to be a man who didn't flinch in the face of adversity, who stood tall in the midst of chaos, who led not with force, but with honor. As the mission continued, Thomas began to see how those lessons were playing out in real time. There were moments when things went wrong, when the mission didn't go as planned, but each time, Thomas found himself relying on his training, on the values he had learned. He led his team with the same quiet strength that Miller had shown him, and it made all the difference. By the end of their deployment, Thomas had earned the respect of his fellow Marines, not through flashy displays of strength or bravado, but through his calm demeanor and his unwavering commitment to doing the right thing. He had become the leader Miller had always known he could be. And as he returned to the camp, Thomas knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight. But he was ready to lead with honor, to serve with integrity, and to carry the lessons he had learned from Miller forward, wherever his journey would take him. As weeks turned into months, Thomas and his fellow Marines settled into their new rhythm. The deployment, while challenging, had begun to feel more like a way of life than a trial. The days blended together, long, exhausting, and filled with moments of tension, but also filled with purpose. They were no longer just recruits in training. They were Marines, doing what they had sworn to do, living up to the values they had been taught. Yet, as time passed, Thomas began to feel the weight of responsibility grow heavier on his shoulders. He had become a leader in his unit, someone others depended on. But with that responsibility came moments of doubt. The missions, although successful, took a toll on the men and women around him. The fatigue, the constant threat of danger, the loss of friends. It was a reality that no amount of training could prepare him for. One night, after a particularly brutal mission, Thomas found himself sitting on the edge of his cot in the barracks, staring at the small photo of his family he kept on the table beside him. The flickering light from a nearby lamp cast long shadows in the room. He couldn't help but think of what they had taught him, of what he had learned from Sergeant Major Miller. Leadership, honor, and duty. But no one had prepared him for the emotional toll, the weight of seeing his team, his brothers and sisters in arms, struggling. There were moments when they would return from a mission, looking shell-shocked, distant, as if the world they had just faced had left an indelible mark on their souls. And Thomas, despite everything he had learned, felt the burden of it all. He was their leader, but he was human. And sometimes, he didn't have all the answers. As the days wore on, the doubts began to fester. What if he wasn't doing enough? What if he couldn't carry the weight of their hopes, their trust? What if he failed them? One afternoon, as he stood by the base, watching the horizon stretch out before him, he felt a presence beside him. It was Miller. The old man had become a quiet fixture in the background, always there, always observing, but never pushing. "You've been quiet lately," Miller said, his voice steady as always. "What's on your mind?" Thomas hesitated, unsure of how to voice the thoughts that had been eating away at him. "I'm not sure if I'm cut out for this," he admitted, the words feeling heavier than he expected. "Being a leader. I see my team struggling, and I don't know how to help them. I don't know if I can be the kind of leader they need." Miller's expression softened. He didn't respond immediately, allowing the silence to stretch between them. Thomas waited, his anxiety growing, but Miller simply stood there, calm and unshaken. After what felt like an eternity, Miller spoke again, his voice low but filled with a quiet strength. "You're doing the best you can, Thomas," he said. "That's all anyone can ask for. But being a leader doesn't mean you have to have all the answers. It means being there when they need you. It means listening, guiding, and sometimes just standing in silence, offering your presence." Thomas looked at Miller, trying to understand. "But how do you deal with it? The loss, the fear?" he asked. "How do you keep going when it feels like everything is falling apart?" Miller's eyes shifted slightly, his gaze distant as if recalling his own struggles from years past. "I won't lie to you," he said slowly. "It never gets easier. You carry it with you, and sometimes it weighs you down. But what matters is how you handle it, how you let it shape you, not break you." The old man paused, his hands resting at his sides. "You'll face things in this life that will challenge you in ways you can't even imagine. But what makes you strong isn't the absence of fear or pain. It's the courage to face them and keep moving forward." Thomas absorbed the words, feeling them sink deep into his chest. He had always thought strength came from physical endurance, from pushing through the hardest parts of training. But now, he realized that true strength was something deeper. It was the strength to carry on even when the weight of the world seemed unbearable. "I can't do this alone," Thomas said softly. "I need to be strong for them, but sometimes I feel like I'm barely holding it together myself." Miller nodded, his eyes steady. "That's the thing about leadership," he said. "You don't do it alone. You lean on those around you, and you let them lean on you. Strength doesn't come from one person. It comes from the whole unit, from everyone lifting each other up." The words were a revelation to Thomas. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his doubts begin to lift. He wasn't alone. He had his team. He had Miller. He had the lessons of the Marine Corps to guide him. And even though the road ahead would be filled with challenges, he knew now that he was capable of facing them. That evening, as he stood once more in the quiet of the base, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Thomas realized something important. Leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being willing to face the unknown, to admit when you didn't have the answers, and to keep moving forward no matter what. He wasn't perfect, and he never would be. But he was ready. Ready to lead his team, ready to face the challenges ahead, and ready to carry the lessons he had learned into whatever came next. The deployment had taken a toll on everyone. What had begun as an uncertain mission now felt like a test of endurance and resolve. For Thomas, every day seemed to be a balancing act, staying true to the lessons he had learned while also finding new ways to adapt and grow. He had always thought that the hardest part of being a Marine would be the physical challenges, the endurance tests, and the obstacle courses. But the reality of deployment had taught him something deeper. It was the emotional toll that came with it, the quiet moments where you were forced to confront the weight of responsibility, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. The first few weeks had been difficult. There were missions that went awry, moments when the tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. There were casualties, close calls, and missions that stretched the limits of their training. But through it all, Thomas held fast to the lessons Miller had imparted. Leadership, duty, respect, and the importance of carrying those values forward in the face of adversity. One day, as Thomas and his team prepared for another mission, something happened that shook him to his core. They had been briefed on the operation. It was a high-risk extraction mission to save a group of civilians trapped in a conflict zone. The intelligence was sketchy, and the enemy forces were known to be heavily armed and well-prepared. As the team gathered their gear and checked their equipment, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The weight of the responsibility, the danger they were about to face. It felt heavier than ever. The mission went as planned, at least at first. The team inserted into the area, moving through the terrain with the precision they had been trained for. But as they neared the extraction point, everything went wrong. Gunfire erupted from all directions, and the team was forced to take cover. The chaos was immediate, and the noise, the roar of gunfire, the thump of explosions, was deafening. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the area, looking for his team, his eyes darting from cover to cover. But in that moment, he realized something. This was the test he had been waiting for, the test that would define him as a leader. In the midst of the confusion, Thomas heard a shout, a Marine's voice, calling out for help. Without thinking, he darted out from cover, running toward the sound. His team followed, their movements coordinated, as they rushed to the aid of the fallen Marine. When they reached him, they found him pinned down, his leg injured and unable to move. Without hesitation, Thomas ordered the team to cover him while they dragged the wounded Marine to safety. It was a chaotic scene, but somehow, they managed to extract him and get him to safety. The sound of gunfire still echoed in the distance, but for a moment, all that mattered was that they had saved one of their own. As they made their way back to their extraction point, Thomas couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. In that moment, he had acted on instinct, on the lessons Miller had taught him about leadership and duty. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't thought about the consequences. He had done what was right. They made it back to the extraction point, the team moving swiftly but cautiously. As the helicopter arrived to take them out of the danger zone, Thomas felt a surge of relief. But it was fleeting. The mission wasn't over, and the sense of responsibility he carried was still heavy on his shoulders. As they boarded the helicopter, Thomas took a moment to look at the faces of his team. They were tired, covered in dirt and sweat, but there was a quiet pride in their eyes. They had completed the mission. They had done what they set out to do. But as the helicopter lifted off the ground and they flew back to base, Thomas felt the weight of the situation settle in. This was just another mission, another day in the life of a Marine. But it was also a reminder that leadership wasn't just about giving orders or following them. It was about making the tough decisions, about acting when others hesitated, and about putting your team before yourself. As the helicopter flew into the distance, the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape below. Thomas sat back, exhausted but content. The journey wasn't over. The challenges would keep coming. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was ready for whatever came. Next, he had learned the hard way that being a leader wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up every day, doing your best, and being there for your team when it mattered most. And as the helicopter soared above the mountains, Thomas knew one thing for certain. He was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He wasn't just a Marine anymore. He was a leader, a brother in arms, and someone who would do whatever it took to protect those who stood beside him. As the days wore on, Thomas and his team adjusted to the grueling rhythm of their mission. The intense operations, the constant vigilance, the feeling of being on edge, all became part of the fabric of their lives. But for Thomas, something had changed. He wasn't the same Marine who had stepped onto that helicopter months ago, unsure of his abilities, questioning his place. He had seen the worst of what the world had to offer, and it had only strengthened his resolve. Leadership was no longer just a concept. It was a responsibility, a duty he wore with pride. One evening, after a particularly exhausting operation, the team gathered in the mess hall. The air was thick with the scent of cooked food, but the usual noise and chatter were subdued. The team was tired, drained from the mission, but there was an unspoken bond between them now. They had been through so much together, and each of them carried a piece of the other's experience. Thomas found himself sitting with his fellow Marines, reflecting on the day's events. The mission had been a success, but it had come at a cost. They had lost one of their own. The reality of combat had hit hard. The team had come together quickly, rallying around each other in the face of tragedy. But it was moments like these, when the mission was over and the adrenaline began to fade, that the true weight of the responsibility began to sink in. It wasn't just about leading a team through a mission. It was about being there for them when the worst happened, when the weight of loss was too much to bear. He had watched his team in the aftermath of their fallen comrade. Some were quiet, staring off into the distance. Others were more vocal, sharing stories of their friend, laughing at memories that now seemed bittersweet. But in all of it, Thomas noticed one thing. They were all leaning on each other. In that moment, he understood the true meaning of leadership. It wasn't about making the hard decisions or being the first one to act. It was about carrying the emotional weight of your team, about being the rock when they needed one. The night passed in a somber, reflective silence. As they finished eating, Thomas found himself walking outside, needing space to clear his mind. The air was cool, the night sky clear and full of stars. He stood by the base, looking out over the dark horizon, his mind heavy with thoughts of their fallen comrade. The loss stung, but it also solidified his commitment to the team. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could make sure that he honored his fallen brother by leading the others through the toughest of times. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, he heard footsteps behind him. It was Miller. The old man had been a quiet presence throughout the deployment, always there in the background, but never demanding attention. He had seen it all, done it all, and yet, he still carried himself with the same calm, unshakable demeanor. Miller stood beside Thomas, his presence comforting in its simplicity. "You all right?" Miller asked, his voice low but filled with concern. Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the distant horizon. "I'm trying to be," he replied. "It's hard, you know, losing someone." Miller remained silent for a moment, letting Thomas process his thoughts. Finally, he spoke again. "It's always hard. Losing someone you care about is never easy. But the thing you need to understand is that it's part of what we do. We don't do this because it's easy. We do it because we believe in something bigger than ourselves." Thomas turned to face Miller, his eyes searching the older man's face. "How do you deal with it? The loss? The pain?" Miller's expression softened, and for the first time, Thomas saw a glimpse of the weight the old man carried. "You don't ever really deal with it," Miller said quietly. "You carry it with you. You learn how to live with it. And you keep moving forward, because that's what they would have wanted. It's what we all would want. You don't honor their memory by giving up. You honor them by continuing to fight, by continuing to lead, by continuing to do what you're here to do." Thomas felt the weight of Miller's words settle deep within him. He had always known that leadership was about more than just being in charge. But now, he understood that it was also about carrying the emotional load of the team, about keeping them grounded when the world seemed to fall apart. It was about keeping their focus, no matter the cost. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," Thomas admitted, the weight of his own insecurities rising again. Miller gave a small, knowing smile. "You're stronger than you think. We all are. It's not about being unbreakable. It's about how you pick yourself up when you're knocked down. And you'll be knocked down. We all are. But you keep getting up. That's the measure of a Marine." The words hung in the air between them, and Thomas realized that he wasn't just learning how to be a leader. He was learning how to live with loss, how to carry the weight of responsibility, and how to keep going in the face of overwhelming odds. The next day, as the team prepared for their next mission, Thomas felt something shift within him. The pain of the loss was still there, but it wasn't all-consuming. He had learned that being a leader wasn't about being perfect. It was about being there for your team, leading by example, and carrying on, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain. And as he looked around at his fellow Marines, he knew that they were all in this together. Whatever happened next, they would face it as a team, as brothers and sisters in arms. And that, he realized, was the strength that would carry them through whatever came their way. The months that followed were filled with challenges, but also a sense of progress. Thomas had become a true leader, one who not only led his team through dangerous missions, but also guided them through the emotional battles that came with the life of a Marine. Each mission, each success, and even the losses had strengthened the bond between the team members. They had grown not only as soldiers, but as a family, united by the shared experiences of combat and the lessons learned along the way. One day, after a particularly successful operation, Thomas found himself standing at the edge of the base, looking out over the landscape. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the horizon, and for the first time in a long while, Thomas allowed himself a moment of reflection. The weight of the responsibility he had carried for so long seemed to lessen, and he could finally breathe without feeling the constant pressure of doubt and fear. He had learned that leadership wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being there for your team, guiding them, and sometimes just listening. It was about showing up every day, doing your best, and being honest about your flaws and limitations. As he stood there, lost in thought, he heard footsteps behind him. It was Miller, the ever-present figure who had been with him since the very beginning. Miller stood next to him, his face still as stoic as ever, but Thomas could see the faintest hint of pride in his eyes. "You've come a long way," Miller said, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "I never doubted you, Thomas. You've become the leader I knew you could be." Thomas glanced at Miller, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said quietly. Miller shook his head slightly. "You did it because you were ready. You took the lessons and made them your own. That's what makes a leader." Thomas felt a lump in his throat, emotions that had been building over the past months finally finding their release. He had learned so much from the old man, about leadership, about sacrifice, about resilience. But more than anything, he had learned what it meant to be a man of honor. "I never thought I could be like you," Thomas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But now, I think I understand." Miller's expression softened, and for a brief moment, he seemed almost human. "We're all just trying to figure it out, son. Every day is a new challenge. But what matters is that you keep moving forward, even when it gets tough. That's what defines us." They stood in silence for a few moments, the weight of their conversation settling in the air around them. It was clear that this was the culmination of everything Thomas had experienced: the physical training, the emotional struggles, the losses, and the victories. It was the moment where he finally understood what it meant to be a Marine, not just in the eyes of his superiors or his fellow soldiers, but in his own eyes. As the sun dipped lower, Miller turned to leave, but not before giving Thomas one last piece of advice. "You're ready for what comes next," he said, his voice firm. "But remember, this isn't the end. It's just another step in the journey." With that, Miller walked away, leaving Thomas standing alone at the edge of the base, looking out over the horizon. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace, a sense that he had found his place in the world. He wasn't just a Marine. He was a leader, a man who had earned the trust of his team, who had faced the hardest challenges with courage, and who had learned to carry the weight of responsibility without letting it break him. And as the sun finally set, casting the camp in darkness, Thomas knew that the lessons he had learned would stay with him forever. They were the foundation of who he had become and who he would continue to be. He wasn't just ready for whatever came next. He was ready to lead, to serve, and to carry on the legacy of those who had taught him what it truly meant to be a Marine. This emotional story follows the journey of a young Marine who, under the guidance of Sergeant Major Miller, learns the true meaning of leadership, sacrifice, and resilience. Through challenging missions, the Marine faces not only physical obstacles, but also emotional battles that shape his character and determine the man he will become. As the story unfolds, the Marine confronts the emotional weight of leadership, especially during moments of loss and hardship. Through his experiences, he learns that being a Marine is about more than just strength and discipline. It is about the emotional strength to face the toughest situations and continue moving forward. This emotional story highlights the internal struggles of a leader, the responsibility of guiding a team through adversity, and the lessons learned from mentors who have walked the path before. As the Marine grows into his role, he discovers that true leadership is built on emotional resilience, compassion, and the ability to carry others through their darkest moments. The emotional journey leads to a moment of reflection where the Marine fully understands the sacrifices made and the honor that comes with wearing the uniform. This emotional story will resonate with anyone who has ever faced challenges in their personal or professional life, as it explores the emotional depths of leadership and what it truly means to serve others.